Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. There are, please do come forward. There are seats over here. There are seats there. There are seats in the middle. Can we leave one at the front, please, for Alex, the doorkeeper? Thank you very much. So tonight we are doing some anthropology on the history of science, and in particular the science of war research and its impact on science, I should say. The scientists, the very major scientists who've been involved in war research, and how that has affected science to this very day. Chris Knight is author not only of Blood Relations, his great classic, but also of this very notable book, Decoding Chomsky, which is an absolutely recommended page turner of a read. Compared to Blood Relations, you really want to know what's going to happen next. Decoding Chomsky, where Chris approached Chomsky and his linguistics as a kind of mumbo-jumbo cult that made no sense at all unless you tried to be an anthropologist and understand Chomsky in the context of his kind of specific culture, his institutional culture and society. So he's going to be telling you about that, but we are first going to listen to Chris's history research assistant, who really has produced all these slides, who's Mark. Yes, the slides and most of the thinking, I should think. So I'm going to hand over to Mark to start off, and Mark's going to try and work.
Hi, and I've now got to put this thing on, which is always more difficult than it looks. Okay, so this talk is mostly going to be about Chomsky rather than Robert Oppenheimer, but because many people have either seen the recent film or have seen about Oppenheimer in recent months, I thought we'd add a bit of him into the mix. He, of course, led the team that developed the atom bomb, and without that team, without the atom bomb, without Robert Oppenheimer, there wouldn't be much of modern science and culture in the way we have seen in the past 50 plus years, and there wouldn't have been a Noam Chomsky, which is rather ironic considering Chomsky is famous amongst most people for being the #1 anti-militarist theorist. He is, as Camilla said, also the world's #1 linguist. There are two Chomskys in a sense, and what this talk is about is how the two Chomskys conflict and where they come from, and probably the most important thing to understand in terms of understanding Chomsky, where he comes from, is the fact that he was always a devoted anti-militarist, a left-wing radical, but he found himself in a job that wasn't exactly ideal because it was working for the Pentagon, for the military at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, which is still perhaps the world's #1 technological institute, and certainly when Chomsky was first working there, was almost entirely funded by the Pentagon. So I've put up this slide to start us off. Don't worry, I'm not going to read it out. Just to give you an example of Chomsky's recent analysis of contemporary politics. You don't have to agree with it. What I would say, and people can disagree with that as well, if you want to understand our world, understanding it from a left-wing perspective is helpful, as well as from many other perspectives. And if you want to understand the left at some of its most sophisticated levels, Chomsky is a very good place to start. He is both very sophisticated and very clear, as you'll see if you've had time to read these couple of paragraphs. And the point I want to make with this in particular is the reason he's so interesting and insightful as regards world politics isn't just because he's clever, he certainly is that, isn't just because he has what I consider to be a very good left-wing political principle background. It's because, as I said, he works for the military, or has worked for the military at MIT. To put it crudely, he knows where the bastards are coming from because he knows them, and that explains, I think, some of that sophistication. Now, the basis, this idea of Chomsky's work and the military has, of course, now the technology is now full because I'm pressing the button and it's not going ahead. So That's brilliant. So, in the past couple of years, as already mentioned, 2 books have been produced by Chris, with some help from me, on Noam Chomsky, on his history, on the anthropology of his intellectual work. One, Decoding Chomsky in 2016, one, this compilation of articles from a conference here that was at University College London back in 2019. An interesting anecdote about this particular book is, although it was produced by UCL Press and we had a very well-attended launch event here back in 2019, there were attempts by pro-Israel lobby people to have the launch perhaps banned. Certainly the management here tried to censor the launch on the basis that somehow someone in the meeting was going to be in some way anti-Semitic. I won't go into details. Suffice to say it was total and absolute nonsense, not least of all because, of course, Chomsky himself is Jewish. The speaker we had speaking, who was from a Jewish background, for what it's worth, I'm from a Jewish background. The woman helping us organize the meeting at UCL was Jewish. It was all total nonsense. But it's part of what I would call a sort of McCarthyite atmosphere that seems to be happening across the West at the moment. It's increasing, I think, now with the terrible tragedies that are happening in Gaza, of an attempt to censor the left in false claims, often of anti-Semitism. But I won't go into too much about that. The meeting went ahead. It was very successful, and Noam Chomsky gave us a lot of support in getting that meeting ahead at UCL. Although it is, talking of anecdotes, interesting to me anyway that not Robert Oppenheimer himself, but his brother Frank Oppenheimer actually worked at UCL in the physics department here back in 1964. And the reason he worked here was because he couldn't find a job in America at all because of his communist associations and the fact that his brother was Robert Oppenheimer. So UCL has a very proud tradition of being a refuge from repression. It has had since perhaps the 19th century, and it's a bit worrying if the management here don't seem to quite get things right. But I'm not going to have any more goes at UCL. It's a great university in its own way as well. And I'll move on to the next slide if that works. Oh, it does work. Fantastic. Okay, this is the Oppenheimer movie, which some people have seen. I think it's a pretty good movie, and it's quite scary because it's about the end of the world and the threat of nuclear weapons. But it's not quite as scary as this little movie I want to show you. This is a film made in 1946 of the first atom bomb test after the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So this is July 1946 in Bikini Atoll. The original plan for this test was to invite the leaders of the world, this was America obviously, invite them to watch it live in order to intimidate them and basically tell them, we, the USA, have these nuclear weapons, no one else does, don't mess with us. That plan wasn't actually implemented, they just made many movies of it. Now we're going to go back to the technology, see if we can achieve this. Back to, and that's it. Okay, so that's another vision of that particular explosion.
To explain that there were, these were all these dead warships with animals.
Oh, just in case people didn't know, the idea of this supposed test, and it wasn't much of a test, Robert Oppenheimer himself opposed this test because he said it would not benefit scientists, it wouldn't help the Americans understand anything about the bomb. It was basically to show off the power they had, and of course they had these old ships, and Japanese ships, old American ships, just to see what it would happen if they just blew up an atom bomb in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I mean, it was a rather pointless thing, but it does look very spectacular. It was very intimidating. But the interesting thing to me, here we have the scientists involved in this test. Now, this is the plutonium bomb. This is the exploded, that created that explosion. The team that made this bomb was, of course, led by the famous Robert Oppenheimer, with his cigarette and the hat. He stormed off. He didn't want to be part of this intimidation propaganda of the US government. He, in fact, wanted to start to perhaps disarm the whole world of nuclear weapons. He was talking about that. That was a big worry to the US establishment. But, and this is the contradiction, despite his left-wing, perhaps anti-militarist sympathies, his doubts about creating the bomb and what the Americans were about to do with it and use it to threaten the world, he couldn't quite bring himself to withdraw his involvement with the military, to say the least. So he invites people from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology from MIT, including this guy here, Jerome Wiesner, to set up the electronics for the bomb. So here we have Wiesner, and here we have the electronics for the bomb, and it's Wiesner who sets them up for that bomb test we've just seen. And Wiesner, again, he's not as radical politically in his history as Oppenheimer. He was never a communist, but he was some sort of liberal. He was a supporter of John F. Kennedy later on, and he had real doubts about this particular test, but he still did the work. And it's this.
He did the wiring.
He did the wiring for this bomb. And what makes this particularly relevant to Chomsky, and this talk is mostly about Chomsky, is the fact that you wouldn't have the military air defense, high-tech computerized systems that Chomsky was later employed to enhance without Oppenheimer supporting the setting up of these systems, these nuclear defense systems, air defense systems, and without Wiesner running all these systems at MIT. And it is Wiesner who gives Chomsky a job in 1955. And Chomsky's linguistics career, his whole career, the reason we've heard of him is because this guy Wiesner, the United States' top military scientist at the time, gave Chomsky this job. And the point, again, I'm trying to reiterate, is the context is of liberal, sometimes quite radically leftist scientists finding themselves in a situation where they're making the most horrific weapons known to humankind, and they're finding themselves in this really conflicted position of making these weapons and then feeling very bad about the way the US military are using these weapons. And it's that conflict at the root of intellectual life at the MIT, and in particular in Chomsky's life, that is the basis of what Chris is later going to talk about in terms of his linguistics, and I'll say a few more things about his politics. And interestingly to me, and I hadn't noticed it till I saw the Oppenheimer film earlier this year, is you realize actually Oppenheimer is in the same contradiction, perhaps at a different level. I mean, in a sense, Chomsky is more contradicted than Oppenheimer, because Oppenheimer is kind of pro-war and anti-war, whereas Chomsky is always anti-war. But they're still somewhere in this very conflicted place. So I'll say a few more things about Jerome Wiesner. As I said, a bit of a liberal. He works with Kennedy in the administration there in the early 60s. He's Kennedy's science advisor. But as you can see, here we go. He says, I helped get the US ballistic missile program established in the face of strong opposition from the Air Force and Department of Defense. He's pushing for these missiles. Here's the Polaris missile. Here's the Minuteman missile. And this is the biggest military build-up, perhaps, in world history, the US build-up of nuclear weapons and other weaponry in the early 60s. And Wiesner, despite some doubts, gets not only involved in it, but he's pushing hard to make the build-up bigger and bigger and more impressive. It's this incredible contradiction. And one of the things Wiesner does, in fact, as an anecdote which is relevant to those of us here in Britain, it's Wiesner's idea to let the British buy US Polaris missiles, these submarine-based missiles. And even to this day, all our politicians want more submarines with Trident submarines with all more missiles. It was all Wiesner's idea back in the early, Chomsky's boss, back in the early 60s. Let the British pay for some pretty useless submarine-borne missiles, which of course we could never use without America's permission anyway. Who would want to use them? It's a monstrous thing, in my opinion. More stuff from Wiesner. Here we go. One of his colleagues in '63, Gerald Zacharias, says Wiesner was soaked in military problems. Since '42, he had had a hand in submarine warfare, air defense, atom bombs, guerrilla warfare, civil defense, and psychological warfare. He was a really well-involved top military scientist, and also involved in the Vietnam War. So here we have, I think that's wrong, it's not tight, it's Life magazine, 67. Wiesner masterminded the communications breakthrough, which is now the backbone of American field communications in Vietnam. He's doing all that work at MIT. And here we have a horrible image from Vietnam of a village being blown up. There's nothing new, tragically, in the way Israel is presently using US weapons and some British weapons to blow up Gaza. They were doing this in Vietnam on an even larger scale back in the 60s. This is Robert McNamara in Vietnam, the guy in glasses and the sleek-backed hair. He was the US Defense Secretary, kind of the architect of the Vietnam War in Kennedy and then Johnson's administration. And here we have the White House in '61. You'll perhaps can see the Southeast Asia, Vietnam. They're discussing a visit to Vietnam at the time. You have several characters here. You have Lyndon Johnson, who is vice president then, later becomes the US president. You have Robert McNamara here having a joke with none other than Jerome Wiesner, Chomsky's boss at MIT, and at this time President Kennedy's science advisor. In fact, Jerome Wiesner, he's in various jobs as president, and he's basically Chomsky's boss for about 20 years at MIT. Now, what is Noam Chomsky's explanation for why Jerome Wiesner, the United States' top military scientist, employed him? Well, he's been asked a few times, and this is the kind of thing he says. I've been in an electronics lab for the last 30 years, largely because Jerome Wiesner was willing to take a chance on some odd ideas. And later in 2009, that was 87, he says, Wiesner was just encouraging strange people with odd ideas. And this refers, of course, to Chomsky's linguistics. Now, I think there's something missing there. Maybe I'm suspicious. Maybe Noam, who is a hero of mine, I don't want to disparage his political work. Maybe he's covering up something. What was Chomsky really being employed to do? Well, we can find that out by looking a bit at what MIT as a whole was involved in this period, what Jerome Wiesner was involved with. And this was, as I said, air defense for the United States against Soviet bombers. I've got to, yeah, okay. So here we have the semi-automatic ground environment, what's called the SAGE control room. This is one of the earlier versions in the late 50s. And the idea was the Soviet bombers would come in, they'd see them on the radar, and they'd be able to work out what missiles to fire at them and whether or when to launch nuclear weapons. This was incredibly high-tech stuff for the period, very advanced, very sophisticated, and it needed the US to invest millions and millions of dollars in order to get things going. It's exactly to do with Dr. Strangelove, the Kubrick movie, the excellent movie from the early 60s. Basically, that film is modeling everything on what the US was actually trying to do at the time. And here we have, yeah, here we have another image from these air defense underground bunkers in the early 1960s of various people staring at screens. It interests me anyway to know where modern computing was invented, where the idea that one should spend all day at work staring at a screen, or even all evening at our leisure staring at screens. And it seems to be it was invented in this US military research projects for air defense back in the late 50s, early 60s, although they're not using mice at that stage, they're using something else here. And yeah, here we have one of these papers from something called the MITRE Corporation, which employed Chomsky as a consultant to help them. And what were they employing him to do? Well, if you read the bit that's underlined here, it says, it's all about the development of a program to establish natural language as an operational language for command and control. In other words, to put it simply, and I can't pretend to be an expert in this, they're trying to work out ways to communicate with what we would now call very old school computers. And those days it involved very complicated programming, which I certainly don't understand. And they're trying to, how can we just have a system whereby someone who isn't trained can type in simple English sentences into a computer, a bit like we can do now, and then get the computers to act, to send missiles here, there, to give other orders in nuclear defense systems within in America at the time. And here we have the distribution list for this particular paper. You'll see N. Chomsky, one of the consultants, and for someone like Chris who knows a lot more about the history of American linguistics, a whole bunch of names here, various people who were famous linguists, students of Chomsky involved in this project back at the MITRE Corporation in the early 60s. And one of those students, Lieutenant J. Kieser, later became Chomsky's boss at MIT. He, for instance, writes another paper talking about how to communicate with computers in English using Chomsky's linguistic theories, because the thing about Chomsky's linguistic theories, as Chris will explain later, is they have a relationship to computer programming. They look a bit like computer programming in the sense that language you're turning sentences into something you might possibly be able to put into a computer. And these are the sorts of sentences they're playing with in this particular paper. Planes fly sorties, planes are B-58s, B-58s must be on base. And for those who don't know what a B-58 is, a B-58 is a supersonic bomber used to carry 5 nuclear bombs back in the early 60s in the US, later superseded by missiles, but it was nuclear bombers were all the rage in this period. And back in, I don't know, when was it, Chris? 2018, some while ago now, Chris emailed Barbara Party, one of these students, and said, look, what were you up to back in those days at the MITRE Corporation, working with Chomsky, doing this linguistics work? And she emailed back and said this. She said, in the event of a nuclear war, the generals will be underground with some computers trying to manage things, and it will probably be easier to teach computers to understand English than to teach the generals to program. Makes a completely fair point. Now, they were a very long way off actually achieving this. I don't want anyone to get the impression that Chomsky is a proper military scientist working with technology. He's not doing that at all. He's trying to understand the underlying theory which would allow other people to do this work later on. But of course, you can't make an atom bomb without an Einstein, and you certainly couldn't do this without having a theoretician behind it all. And that was Chomsky's role. But as we shall see, he was always in a little bit of denial about this military involvement. He didn't like going to the MITRE Corporation. We were even told, I think, by some of his students that when he went there, he wouldn't get security clearance. He didn't want to be so involved. So the students would have to shepherd him around the building, showing their passes, a bit like you might do in other circumstances. So much so that when Chomsky needed to go to the loo, a student would have to go with him because he couldn't wander around the building on his own. Despite the fact that obviously Chomsky was well up, above the students in the hierarchy, but he absolutely refused to get security clearance because he didn't want to be associated with the military. So you'll hopefully understand it's the conflicted position. I'm not suggesting for one second, and neither is Chris, that Chomsky's anti-militarism, his leftism, isn't absolutely genuine. It is, but like many people, he's found himself in a career, in a job, where there are very serious conflicts he has to resolve. And one of the ways is this attitude towards the military work he was doing back then. Things start to change in the mid-60s. The Vietnam War is at its height. Students start protesting. Chomsky is already campaigning against the war, but not having much of a response at first. But because the student movement is growing and growing, it gets so strong, they start campaigning not just against Vietnam, but against military research at their own university. So this is MIT students in 1969 closing down the whole university. They're in the corridors next to the president and the administration's offices at MIT, really causing serious trouble, saying things like stop MIRV. Now, I always forget what that stands for. Multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles. Okay, so that's the idea. All the nuclear missiles nowadays that Britain and other countries have, one missile goes up, several missiles then come out of that one missile. So one missile going up from a submarine can kill 50 million people or something across Russia or wherever. And this was all being developed at MIT in the 60s, and these radical students were saying, maybe this is a bit morally wrong and a bit dangerous. I mean, they're saying more than that. They want a revolution because it's absurd that all the greatest thinkers, some of them anyway, in the US are using their brains for this completely insane and other insane projects. Convert. You say they want to convert military technology to stuff that isn't quite so brutal. And it's great to see down here, MIT students are still, like everyone else at MIT, so many of them still have some involvement with the military, but many of them also are supporting anti-war campaigns. And so here we have Jewish MIT students in particular campaigning for the Palestinians. There's been a bit of just in the past couple of weeks, there were some protests in the very same corridors where these protests were back in '69, pro-Palestinian students doing sit-down protests, not on this scale, unfortunately. Other students who support Israel attacking them, whole kerfuffle, and students are threatened with suspension, the usual stuff that you get. But it's good to see there is still a tradition at MIT of opposition to war, as well as others who, of course, are contributing to more wars. This guy is particularly interesting, the guy here, the face here. This is a guy, John Kabat-Zinn. Some people may have heard of him. He's now famous for being the man who introduced mindfulness meditation to the world, or not to the world, to the Western world. It was already well known in the East. But at this time he was a left-wing sort of student activist, and one of his motivations, I suspect, was the fact that his father had been a communist and had lost his job. So he was, again, one of these people who was, his father was very conflicted, I suspect. His father actually did biological weapons research for the US during the Second World War. Then they discovered he was a communist after the war, or began to care about it, and then he lost his job. So I suspect this is one of his and many other people motivated. This bizarre contradiction in US universities back in the 1960s of having a memory of this period when they were treated really very badly, and suddenly there's this atmosphere of freedom and they want to rebel and everything sort of explodes, as you can see there. And this has a huge impact on Chomsky. Here he is at one of the teach-ins that took place back in '69. On the left here you have John Kabat-Zinn having an argument with Jerome Wiesner. You see, they're arguing about the use of MIT to develop military technology and whether that's moral or not moral. Chomsky, of course, is in a bit of a conundrum. He could resign, as he says. I've given a good bit of thought to resigning from MIT, which is more than any other university associated with the activities of the Department of Defense. Again, other quotes from this period. He's saying he's feeling guilty. I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror anymore. So what does he do? Well, he could have simply resigned, lost his prestigious job, lost his influence, and become, the sort of activist that I quite admire. But maybe he would have not been heard of after that, or not so famous. He made a different decision. I'm not sure whether it was the right decision or the wrong decision, but it's the decision he made. He decided not to support the students in their demands to close down all military research at MIT. Rather, he decided to continue his work at MIT, but to write book after book after book after book, do talk after talk after talk after talk, explaining to the world how barbaric the US military are, while that same US military were funding his career. It's an amazing choice. It hugely inspired me. I would recommend anyone and everyone who wants to understand the past 50 years to read Chomsky's books. But in a way, his actual history, how he came to this situation is absolutely fascinating as well. And just to reassure everyone, nothing Chomsky ever did for the US military ever achieved any kind of success. There were no weapons that came out of it. So I think in a way he made the right choice. But I think it's also right for us to try to understand why he made that choice and who he is now. So please do not be put off by all my having a go at poor old Noam, or indeed Chris having a go at him. His political work is absolutely top-notch, precisely because he is in the heart of the beast. He is at the heart of the military-industrial complex. So, as you would expect, the students don't just protest in the hallways of administration. They actually go to the very laboratories where they're making these appalling weapons, both helicopter systems for bombing Vietnam and these multiple, whatever they were, nuclear weapon systems. They're also making the Apollo systems that allowed humans to land on the moon, which is, of course, rather more benign. But they're not messing around. They want to close down these factories. They picket the labs rather than the factories in '69. And of course, the police move in. 7 activists are injured, 6 imprisoned, some for merely leafleting MIT classes. They came down, as one university lecturer said, like a ton of bricks on the students, because whereas you can cause as much trouble as you like here at UCL, it's probably not going to close down the British military-industrial complex. MIT is different. If students start protesting there, it's right in the heart of the machine, and it's a real threat. And they were really quite tough on the students. So here you have the riot police coming in, and pretty normal stuff, being attacked, blah blah blah. And the student protests, they died. They don't disappear entirely. They keep going. I can't go into all the whole history of US student protest and where it ended up, but certainly MIT's role was very, very crucial. Now this is what they're protesting against, of course. The real prospect of not just Hiroshima, this is the aftermath of the Hiroshima bombing, but of much of the planet, certainly all the many cities in Russia, China, America, ending up like this. And tragically, when me and Chris were first discussing Chomsky back in 2017, we all sort of imagined, oh, the nuclear, it's interesting stuff, but it's all a bit old hat. Is there going to be a nuclear war now? Seems pretty unlikely. Well, since the confrontation in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we're now closer to nuclear war perhaps than at any time in history, according to some commentators. It's a very, very scary time. And of course, with the confrontation in Gaza, it's quite possible there'll be a confrontation with Iran. Again, Iran, there's this nuclear threat there, and the threat of the Americans or the Israelis bombing Iran with nuclear weapons. If that isn't all bad enough, there's Pakistan, India, and those countries threatening each other. Unfortunately, we are in the shadow of the atom bomb all over again. And it's inspiring to me that the students at the heart of the university that was manufacturing this sort of terrible weaponry did try to stop it all back in the day. And just to bring us back, before I pass on to Chris, about Robert Oppenheimer, here's a couple of quotes. This is what Robert Oppenheimer said about Hiroshima. "I believe we had a great cause to do this, but I do not think that our consciences should be entirely easy." This is Oppenheimer when asked about authorizing, he organized the bomb, not just the making of the bomb, but he was there at the meetings where they decided to drop the bomb on and kill 100,000 civilians in Hiroshima back in 1945. And in 1965, he still can't quite bring himself to say it was an evil or wrong thing to do. He's very, very conflicted, and that to me is interesting because it's that conflict, it's that contradiction in the head of many of these scientists, including in a rather different way Chomsky, that I think is at the root of what I'm trying to explain here. And just to give you an idea of quite how barbaric Oppenheimer became, despite the fact he clearly is a very decent man at the same time. Again, conflicted. It's not one thing or the other. In 1943, they're not sure whether the bomb's actually going to work. They're thinking, okay, maybe what we could do instead is we can just drop radioactive material all over Germany and poison huge numbers of civilians. Maybe that's the way we can win the war. And Oppenheimer, in a letter, is writing about this and says, as you can read, "On the question of the radioactively poisoned foods that they're discussing, I think we should not attempt a plan unless we can poison food sufficient to kill 500,000. This is his argument. There's no point even bothering unless we can kill 500,000 German civilians. That's how barbaric you become if you're a scientist who works for the US or any other military for that matter. And this, my point is, this is why Chomsky found himself, he was in a similar environment, not at the height of World War II, but at the height of the Cold War and then the war in Vietnam, in a similar contradiction, with a similar blackboard. But he, unlike Oppenheimer, was always genuinely against war. He would never have actually intentionally made a weapon in the way Oppenheimer did. And in fact, he's said on several occasions when he, as a teenager, when he heard about the bombing of Hiroshima, "I walked off into the woods. I felt completely isolated." He just felt completely cut off from every other friend, every other contemporary, because he could see how horrific it was, and he was so upset that most Americans were cheering when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. So in a way, the point I'm making is both that Chomsky is a more principled scientist than Oppenheimer, but for that precise reason, more conflicted, and therefore it affects his work more. I can't really think how, perhaps certainly not up until 1945, how Oppenheimer's principles in any way affected what work he did. It made no difference. Chomsky's principles always affected what work he did, and Chris will hopefully talk more about that. And I'll end on one more slide before I pass on to Chris, just to give you an example of this. Maybe I'm pushing the argument too hard here, but to show you quite how conflicted poor old Noam has been over the years, despite his undoubted genius. He ended up, because he's at MIT, he becomes a friend of none other than John Deutsch. John Deutsch was, amongst many other things, one of the United States' top war scientists. He, for instance, didn't invent drones, but he was the Pentagon administrator who pushed for the introduction of drones in US defense policy in the 90s, basically invented a world of that sort of horrific weaponry. As also the same applies to nuclear weapons. He was a huge fan of nuclear weapons as well. And as I said, this is Chomsky on Deutsch. They were friends, even though he was the head of the CIA. Now, to most people who are left-wing activists, fans of Chomsky, it's very confusing. Sorry, he's the most principled anti-militarist intellectual in the world, and he's friends of the head of the CIA. It's very conflicted. And as some people might know, We now know Chomsky was also somewhat on a friendly terms with a certain Jeffrey Epstein, as was Marvin Minsky and other MIT scientists, because Epstein was schmoozing with all the scientists he could schmooze with in order to pay them money. It was all to cover up his appalling crimes. And Chomsky, when asked about this just a few months ago, he said, "I knew Epstein and met with him a number of times. I've met all sorts of people, including major war criminals. I don't regret having met any of them." Now, whether he does or doesn't regret isn't the issue. The issue is, how can perhaps the world's most famous radical left-wing anarchist intellectual live? How can he think in a situation where his job and his work relations are so conflicted with people who he absolutely despises everything they represent? What does that mean for his thought processes? Well, I don't think it has really affected his politics. His politics is really generally very principled. You can argue here and there about it, but he's a huge inspiration, and please do read Chomsky's work, watch his YouTube videos. His linguistics is something else, and that's why I'm going to let Chris talk about that.
Okay. Well, as I suppose everybody knows, I am an anthropologist. And if you're an anthropologist and you're in some strange, to you, unfamiliar culture, and you're finding maybe a shaman who's in a trance and saying strange things and you can't understand it, and it might seem to, like me coming from London, ooh, this doesn't seem to make any sense. It's incomprehensible nonsense this guy's spouting, you know. You mustn't think that. You're an anthropologist. You have to realize that in order to understand what might appear to be total incomprehensible nonsense, you've got to put it in context, get to learn about the history, the local history, the culture, and see why what might have initially appear utter nonsense actually appears to these people in this time, in this place, absolute brilliant genius, intuition and sense. So I have to say that when I first came across Noam Chomsky's linguistics, I just thought this is complete nonsense. I mean, absolutely just doesn't make any sense at all. And so I just thought, right, Chris, you mustn't just dismiss it. You've got to find out why this apparent utter nonsense at one point in time made sense to one particular tribe. What was the period? What was this tribe? Find out. And what I found out was that Chomsky's linguistics was formed actually within the context that Mark has described. It was a particular, I would say, tribe of young, white, overwhelmingly male computer nerds who are on the brink of a major development in science, namely that digital computers were just being anticipated. You had huge mainframe computers taking up vast amounts of space and causing amounts of heat, but still the vision of computers was just absolutely thrilling. And this was the community within which Chomsky linguistics developed. Now, of course, you might ask me, well, Chris, why did you think it was complete and utter nonsense in the first place? So I'll just go through a quick list of bizarre beliefs. And these are Chomsky's firmly held doctrines. It's true that his theories have changed massively over the years, but throughout all the changes, I argue in my book that he only made these changes because the first model didn't work, the next model didn't work, the next model didn't work, and each time something didn't work, he thought, well, okay, I better think again. But he never abandoned the fundamental premises of his linguistics. So first of all, he legislated what language is, and it had to be something amenable to the methods of natural science. So do everyone clear what I mean by natural science? it's physics, it's chemistry, it's biology. Language is just a part of nature. What I mean is, do not even think of using social science. Because for Chomsky, social science means ideology, it means politics. He just wants to do proper science, and proper science is maths, physics, chemistry, biology. So language is a part of nature. Oh, right, okay, so what do you mean by that, Noam? He said it's an object in the head. It's an object in everybody's head. If every human child is born with this thing, it's a thing, and what it is, it's a miniature, guess what? Digital computer inside everyone's head. And what it does is it computes. And if you are an animal with this language acquisition device or this language module in your head, genetically planted there, what it means is you can think. So chimpanzees don't think, elephants don't think, dolphins don't think, animals don't think, but in order to think you have to have this digital computer, because language exists for this purpose. When you've got it, you talk to yourself. Language exists for talking to yourself. Language has no intrinsic or necessary connection with communication. It's got nothing to do with communication. Language itself is for computing internally inside the head. And if you've got language in your head, in this digital computer, already implanted, the little child equipped with this module doesn't need to learn anything. Now again, you might think, why is Chomsky saying that? Well, of course, if the child had to learn something, you would have to learn something from somebody or some other person. What's the problem there? Social science. You're learning from other people. The child's interacting with other people. That's social. No, it mustn't be social, it must be just natural science. To be natural science, the child has to have in its head all the world's languages implanted from the beginning. So, okay, because he has to do natural science, he's legislated that, and because if it was political or social, the military wouldn't support it, okay, he's going to do natural science, and he has this. It's pretty clear, says Chomsky, quite recently actually, it's pretty clear that a child approaches the problem of language acquisition, in other words, acquiring its first language, by having all possible languages in its head, but doesn't know which language it's being exposed to. And as data comes along, that class of possible language reduces. So certain data comes along, and the mind automatically says, okay, it's not that language, it's some other language. Now, I think you can see that if you were talking about a computer, that probably, certainly the kinds of computers that were being developed in the 50s and 60s, that would be quite a good argument. You'd have to install the language inside the head from the beginning, because the computer doesn't walk around, meet people, say hello, doesn't engage in social interactions. It's just a huge single individual computer. And so Chomsky, don't forget, Chomsky's having to do natural science, not social science. The military want natural science, they want proper science, as it were, and for the reasons actually that, of course, Marx discussed. I mean, what the military wanted was a kind of linguistics which would be useful for missile guidance and control, command and control over missile systems. What they wanted was to be able to find a version of language where a general, some military guy could, instead of having to sort of use complicated computers to make the missile go in the right place, you just talk at it. You type on a keyboard, hit them Viet Cong, go right, go left, not there you bastard. You could just use English, and because the computer's got inside it, maybe in the nose cone of the missile, but in somewhere guiding the missile, it's got kind of all the world's languages already installed. It will understand and it will do what it's told to do. So now, okay, you might say, okay, why would anyone believe that that was anything to do with how a child acquires language? It's actually worse than that. In my book, I describe how what Chomsky says about word meanings. He says word meanings, words and their meanings, or what they call lexical concepts, like a word like house, for example. House, he doesn't talk about the sound. He says whatever the sound is in a language, for house, the lexical concept, the meaning like house, is part of the human genome. So humans have the concept house, the lexical concept house, like the word for house, whatever the sound is. The sound might vary, but the meaning stays the same. From birth. Okay, house, climb, tree, book. Now when you come to book, perhaps you might think, and by the way, what I'm doing, I'm trying to explain why I thought all of this was nonsense, right? Okay, book. Okay, so Homo sapiens had installed in its head the concept of a book when we evolved. Think about that. We didn't have books, but we already had the concept book in our head. So a famous philosopher said, well, right, Noam, you're saying book, climb, house, tree are all concepts genetically installed from birth. What about bureaucrat? Yeah, says Chomsky, yeah. That it must. Have we got more slides here? I'm supposed to do more slides, okay. All right, there we are. Thanks. Great. There is overwhelming reason to believe that concepts like, say, climb, chase, run, tree, and book, and so on, are fundamentally fixed. Furthermore, there is good reason to suppose that the argument is at least in substantial measure correct, even for such words as carburetor and bureaucrat. However surprising the conclusion may be that nature has provided us with an innate stock of concepts, and that the child's task is to discover their labels, the empirical facts appear to leave open few other possibilities. So, okay, so carburetor was installed in the brain of Homo sapiens before we'd invented the wheel, let alone motor cars and carburetors as part of internal combustion engines. Right, clearly what Chomsky is talking about is not a human child and not a person, it's a computer. And of course the military, what they wanted wasn't like children or human beings anymore doing the guidance, they wanted computers to do it. And so Chomsky was kind of reconstructing linguistics, the languages, I understand it, you understand it, in completely novel terms, because the military just weren't interested in how a particular group of Aboriginal Australians use the word for mother-in-law, or how Navajo think of the spirits. They wanted something technical that would work. So anyway, Chomsky came up with some ideas as to how this sort of universal grammar, as he called it. Universal grammar had to be the underlying grammar of all the world's languages, the core principle of all the world's languages. And once you'd cracked that code and found this underlying language, it should enable you to do all these extraordinary feats in terms of instructing missiles in any language, actually. Where to go, what to do, who to bomb. In actual fact, of course, as soon as Chomsky started this, his linguistics critics, people who actually studied real languages, complained, well, Noam, why do you think all the world's languages are just like English? Because, of course, the US military wanted to be able to talk English at their missiles. And so, not surprisingly, Chomsky's linguistics reflected that local pressure. So Chomsky did develop, to begin with, a version of this thing called universal grammar, which applied to English but didn't apply to other languages. I won't go on because it's all in the book, and I can say a lot more about it. But the critical thing I want to say is that Chomsky was working for the military, and yet detested the military, and he had to find a solution to that paradox, the one that Marx, I think, brilliantly outlined. And the solution he arrived at, and it's just so strange that no one can see this. I haven't found anyone on the left who's prepared to accept this. So people on the left just won't accept, I've noticed, people in these various different, left-wing groups, the Socialist Workers' Party or whatever they are, they won't accept any criticism of Chomsky's linguistics because everybody knows Chomsky's such a good guy. He's on our side, he's one of us. Don't criticize his linguistics. And the same one, when I've spent many years working with linguists, and they just say, oh, Chomsky's politics kind of not relevant. His linguistics is really, really cutting edge. It's brilliant. He's redefined language. He's absolutely the number one genius in linguistics. Never mind about his politics. So can you see on each side they're saying don't worry about the other thing. So if you're on the left, don't worry about the linguistics. If you're interested in the linguistics, don't worry about the politics. No, that doesn't help at all. In order to understand either the politics or the linguistics, you have to understand the relationship between them. And that relationship is pure conflict, pure paradox. There's actually not just no connection between the science and the politics in his case, but there's an opposition of contradiction. Chomsky himself was actually asked, I've got it by an interviewer, Noam, there are two of you, aren't there? There's the political activist and the linguist. What does the one Chomsky say to the other when they meet? And Chomsky says, no, they don't have anything to say. The one Chomsky has nothing to say to the other. And what I want to point out is that in order to survive, Chomsky had to make sure there was no common ground between his politics and his linguistics. If there had been any fixed connection between the two, there would have been terrible problems. He wanted to be free to do his work for the military and free to conduct his activism against the military. Completely opposite, but he wanted each to be free and therefore independent of the other. And that meant getting rid of any common ground. So from his linguistics, he had to exclude any politics. So his linguistics had to be natural science, because any element of social dynamics, no, that's going to lead to politics. Keep it pure, keep it apolitical, keep it non-political, just like physics or chemistry, there's no politics. But to get rid of politics from language, can you see, you have to get rid of the social. You're obliged to say that language has got nothing to do with communication. You have to say that language has got nothing to do with, say, social learning. You have to say that language is just an object in the head. He's forced to do that. And have you noticed as well, in his political activism, he never appeals to his science. Never in his political activism does he invoke the science of linguistics. His political activism works fine without any, quote, science whatsoever. It's critical that those two things have nothing to do with each other, almost as if they're not on speaking terms with each other. So that is how I explain Chomsky's linguistics. The problem is, of course, that if you take away communication, learning, social interaction, all the things which make language what it is, you actually haven't actually got language anymore. And it is really, to me, it's absolutely astonishing that for 30, 40 years, Chomsky has been considered the #1 theoretician of language in the world, actually, certainly in the Western world. And as I say, I find that odd, because none of his theories work, and what his theories are about has got no connection with what you or I would mean by language. So in his conception, language is this digital computer, and it has strange properties. For example, he says it is perfect in design, or, as he puts it, doesn't want to be too categorical, near perfect. And he says himself, he says, right, look at, he says, I'm saying this is biology, but he says it's not biology as we know it. And what he says is that in biology you have adaptations. You have the spine, you have the brain, you have all these different adaptations, and they're always a sort of compromise between conflicting demands. Nothing is perfect in biology. You don't have a perfect brain, a perfect wing, that's not. If you have something which is perfect, that sounds like a snow crystal or a diamond, something in nature. And so you then say to Chomsky, right, let's just, for the sake of the argument, let's say, well, language is this weirdly perfect object in the brain. Okay, next question, how did it get there? How did it evolve? How do you get something perfect appearing in the human brain but not in any other brain? Now, initially, Chomsky didn't want to discuss all that sort of stuff. But what happened was that I, along with somebody called Jim Herford, in 1996, we set up a kind of research organisation called Evolang. We had a conference in 1996, another one 2 years later. They're still going on today. We have Evolang. It's a massive international conference series on the evolutionary emergence of language. And in 2000, am I right, Camilla? Was it in 2000? I think it was in Boston. 2002 in Boston. Okay, right. Chomsky turned up. So I won't go into all the details, but we were having our conference on the origins of language, and Chomsky was right next door to us in Boston, but he didn't turn up. But then the last day of the conference, there was a very, very, very special event. And the hall was filling, massive attendance, far more than for any other speaker in the whole week-long conference. And then there's a sudden hush. The whole room fell silent. And Chomsky shuffled along from the back. You could have heard a pin drop. And he got up to the lectern, and he said something like, I don't know what all of you have been talking about. I don't know, Neanderthals, theories, the origin. So, that's how he always talks a sort of monotone, low key when he's doing these things. What he was really saying is that you've got all your funny theories. I've got a theory. It's probably not right, but it's as good as anyone else's theory about why we have language. And what it was is as follows: it was there was a macromutation, and he's kept to that idea all along. So have we got a slide for that? Too long. Oh, all right. Okay, let's do a few slides. Okay.
That's the watermark stuff.
Yeah, we want this one. Here we are. Oh, that's the one. Right. Okay. Okay. So Chomsky's friends were saying, Noam, there's that troublemaker Chris Nye and his friends. They're gonna want some theory from you. How did language evolve? Where did it come from? You've got this, it's perfect, design perfect digital computer in the head. And they get there. Chimpanzees don't seem to have it. Other animals, but humans have got the perfect one, right? So Chomsky said, there was a sudden macromutation, a chance mutation, and his word is always installed. It installed a digital computer in one individual's head, and once that individual had this computer installed, it could think. So and he always kept to the same idea. The best one, the most sort of spelt out version is, there was once a kind of ape man, and he called him Prometheus, and he was wandering around in the distant past. And there was a cosmic ray shower, some supernova explosion in some distant galaxy, and it caused these cosmic rays. And the cosmic rays caused a mutation in this individual, which installed a perfectly formed language organ, whereupon that particular individual could think, because it could talk to itself, and therefore that's what thinking is, it's talking to yourself. And as a result of having more clear thinking, it was reproductively successful. So it had more babies, and then eventually had a population of individuals who could think thanks to this mutation. Now, of course, when Chomsky went to the Vatican, I saw it in here, by the way, and announced his idea that language was created from nothing, from no Darwinism is wrong, there's no build-up, there's no evolutionary process, no natural selection. So suddenly there was a kind of miracle, and it installed language in the head, and then that made this person conscious and able to think. The Vatican were very pleased about that, because it confirmed all their beliefs. So how do I end this? We've got to stop in a second.
You go to the next slide.
Next slide, thank you.
Explanation of all the mystery. There you go.
Okay. Right, okay, this is it, yes. A language system emerged, perhaps some small rewiring of the brain, some small mutation. Once you have this lucky or unlucky person 75,000 years ago who had that mutation, that person could think. Nobody else could think. It couldn't communicate with anybody because that was the only person who had it. So he's basically saying chimpanzees can't think. Animals can't think. You've got to have this little digital computer in your head. A capacity like that can get transmitted to offspring, and then those offspring might turn out to dominate the society. Well, at that point, some bright guy might have had the idea of exterminate. So he says, at some point, much, much later, perhaps 10,000 years later, some bright guy thought, I can think because I've got language. Maybe we can externalize language. Means actually make other people aware of what we're thinking. Now, Chomsky is not interested in that. He's not interested in it. He's not interested in French, Swahili, Turkish, Mandarin. I mean, not interested in what we think of as languages, because they're just external. He's interested in the internal thing inside the head. And so he leaves all theorizing about what we would call the origin of language to somebody else, because it's all social stuff we can never know. And all he's interested in is this perfect object in the head. Is that the end of the... oh, yes, I know. Okay, okay, right. Just to end up, I didn't know this, but Mark here has informed me of what's going on now. Not only was Chomsky working for the military throughout his entire career, I mean, that research laboratory of electronics was the the intellectual center of the Pentagon in so many ways. But even now, he's still, I say even now, he's not well, and we miss him, I have to say, for reasons Mark's discussed. I mean, I wish we had his voice now with what's going on in Gaza. As a Jewish activist, his voice would be so necessary here, but he's not able to speak anymore. But right up to recently, up to this year, beginning of this year, Chomsky's been publishing with this guy called Watu Mul. And, okay, so what's happened is, I said earlier, didn't I, that Chomsky, his theories are always changing, wildly changing from one extreme to the other. I mean, perhaps I should just say, first of all, this object in the head was vastly complex. It was a language organ filled with all kinds of complexities, because it had to have inside it all the world's grammars, all the world's words, bureaucrat, wheel, steam engine, all these were all packed in it, vastly complex. When I and others confronted him in Boston in 2002, and the build-up to that, his friends were saying, no, come on, we've got to have a more credible theory than one random mutation producing it from nowhere, this vastly complex organ. So Chomsky said, all right, instead of this organ being vastly complex, how about it's extraordinarily simple, so simple that it amounts to one simple thing, merge. So that's called, so he went from sort of maximalism to what was called minimalism. Minimalism is his latest paradigm in linguistics. Minimalism means that the mutation had to do a tiny thing and install merge. What does merge mean? It all sounds very complex. It's ever so simple. It means putting one word together with another. It means merging two words, two or more words to make a sentence. So it's vastly simple. So we've gone from vast complexity to extraordinary simplicity. But we've also moved from the most kind of, to me, insane extremity of genetic determinism. I mean, saying that carburetor and wheel and all these words are installed genetically in the head. And, the left are always complaining about genetic determinism. He's the most extreme genetic determinism you can find on the planet. Okay, and then suddenly, within last few years, he said, okay, forget human genetics altogether. People in other galaxies, extraterrestrials, would have language just like English. They would have universal grammar. So we ought to be able to talk to extraterrestrials. The Martian language might not be so different from human language. We should expect that any language anywhere in the universe would resemble human language. Human grammar is not specific to our species, but universal in the deepest of senses. Any extraterrestrial intelligence would likely run human-style linguistic software, thus eliminating any principal limit to effective communication with extraterrestrials. Would extraterrestrials share our sense of beauty? We think it likely. Roberts, Watermull and Chomsky. And I mean, I don't know too much about Watermull. If you're interested, we can have questions, and Mark can say a little bit more about this guy. But he's still working for the military now, and some aspects of the Navy are still thinking that maybe there's something about artificial intelligence that Chomsky and linguistics can explain for us. Hang on, where we got to? Yes, okay, that's the story. Okay, okay, that's my website, scienceandrevolution.org. I suppose I should just end by saying I miss Chomsky. He was a voice of sanity in a world going mad. But I should also say that his linguistics wasn't just wrong. It wasn't just catastrophically wrong. It was immensely damaging, because he was the prestigious Pentagon-backed scientist who invented the idea that the mind is full of little computers, and that these are what govern the way humans behave and other creatures behave. It was called the modular mind idea, but more generally, Chomsky was the source really of this massive event that took place in the 70s and 80s, and it's called the cognitive revolution. The cognitive revolution put cognition on the map. I've got, in my flat, I've got books all over the place, of course. All the books, if you look at the books published after about 1975, they're all about the mind, the lopsided mind, the mind in the cave, the prehistory of mind, everything's got mind, 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 mind. Go back a little bit earlier, when you had behaviorism as the dominant paradigm, mind didn't exist, you have bodies. So we've gone from only bodies exist and no mind to only mind exists. And actually Chomsky says body is a problematic concept. Mind is what's real. Bodies are, there's no concept of body, he actually says. So it's like turning materialism in the philosophical sense, the idea that people's ideas arise in their minds owing to the kind of lives we lead, subsistence strategies, making a living, those interactions between real people and other creatures like apes, the interactions between real bodies generate ideas in the head. Instead, everything was turned upside down by a really horrendously stupid school called evolutionary psychology in the United States, where it was essentially mind over matter. And when they said that there's like a face recognition module, the cheat detection module, there's all these, the brain's full of all these modules. The reason they were able to say with authority that we have these modules is because Chomsky had discovered the fundamental module, the one that makes us human, the language module. And what I'm saying is it wasn't just wrong, it was horribly damaging. It turned not just Marxism on its head, it turned even common sense history, sociology, just rationality on its head under influence from the US military, while at the same time, when you hear Chomsky speaking not as a scientist, but as an intelligent activist, it's always such a breath of fresh air, and we miss you. That's my website. So, questions and arguments and brickbats. You're allowed to disagree very profoundly. Nick.
I thought that was a great talk. I quickly had a look at the book again this afternoon. It's great, it's fascinating, I recommend. I had a quick look at your book this afternoon.
Oh, right, okay.
I think it's great. I've read it before when it came out, and I recommend that everyone reads it. I've got a something of a critique, not your main argument, but I think you're being too kind to Noam Chomsky in a way. It seems clear from what you both said that Noam Chomsky, in terms of his academic work, his intellectual work, in terms of his career, was captured by the idea of computers just as they were emerging. And there's a whole school of thought still that computers are an analog for the human brain and mind and everything, which I disagree with. I actually worked as a computer programmer for 20 years, and I don't think it's anything like that at all.
Exactly.
So I dispute the idea that artificial intelligence is on the verge of replacing human beings and so on like that. I think that's a...
I've never said any such thing.
No, you've never said that. I would dispute the argument that we're hearing now from the likes of Musk and so on, that artificial intelligence is just such an amazing thing that they're actually on the verge of replicating what human beings can do, but much faster and on a much larger scale, and that we will become redundant as a result of that. I reject that entirely. But obviously, Noam Chomsky fits in with that school of thought that you can actually get computers that what the human language module, as he calls it, is an analog of a computer, if you like. And your argument seems to be that he had to stick to this to because otherwise he was morally conflicted, and you've got quotes that prove that, about the fact that he was being funded by the military, and plus his work, the military was seeking to use his work, and he was going as a consultant to military conferences and so on, and so they thought it could be useful for them. But I don't think it's the case that he came up with this theory because he was conflicted. He came up with his theory because that's what he was paid to do.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what the military wanted him to do. If there's one step he failed to take as a result of being conflicted, he didn't actually build any machines. He came up with the theory. So he saw himself, if you're doing an analogue between the development of nuclear weapons and so on, if you're doing an analogy with that, he saw himself as the Einstein who came up with the linguistic equivalent of E equals mc squared. But he wasn't prepared to be the Oppenheimer who actually built the bomb. So that's where his morality led him as far as his academic work was concerned. I don't think he. I mean, it would actually have been. He could have overcome that conflict if it turned round to those who were funding him and said, "This is nonsense. It doesn't work. You're not going to be able to do what you want to do." And if he actually developed linguistics as a school of social science. So I think he was part of, that was the thinking at the time. That's what he was paid to do, and that's what he did. And he kept a separation between science and politics and so on. But I think his politics equally can't have as much depth as you're claiming for them if he rejects the whole of all the insights which you have and Marxism potentially gives to.
Well, as everyone knows, I think the most revolutionary form of knowledge is science. I think politics should never be allowed to influence science. But I definitely think science should be not just influencing politics, but I think any revolutionary politics should be entirely based on science. I mean, like, take climate science. I mean, the politicians are now destroying the planet, and what they should be doing is taking science as almost like sacred international knowledge, act on that knowledge. But I would just say, sort of in defense of Chomsky, you said that he goes along with this idea about humans being replaced by these.
That's not what he does.
No, okay, Nick, but he doesn't, you see. Or rather, he does in his science mode, but when he's talking to people, his activist supporters, he never says that. He'll talk about, what's going on in Gaza. He'll talk about Ukraine. He'll talk about climate disaster. He will never say, "Oh, the major threat is, machines which are more intelligent than humans." But he will say that in that other mode when he puts his other hat on, his so-called scientific hat, and spouts with this funny guy called Watermull who works for the US Navy. So again, when you say Chomsky says this or doesn't say that, you always have to be quite careful. Which of the two Noam Chomskys do you mean? At the back. Have you got someone? Yeah.
Well, go at the back and then John after that, okay?
Okay, yes.
How can Chomsky get fired or shot? Yeah. I just don't understand it. I mean, it's either a very positive or very negative.
Oh my God. Yeah. Okay. I mean, we do have an answer, and we actually, Mark and I have got an article in Aeon magazine, AEON, coming out in a week's time, where we try to deal with exactly that idea. My initial idea is this. Chomsky's idea just had to be true. And the reason is this. I mean, when I say had to be, it was like in some religions, certain things just have to be true, even if they're obviously not true at all. But what had to be true is that if you understand digital computing, it gives you an opening into the very nature of the human mind. So if you understand this complex digital computer, that is the mind, and what that does is it elevates these, what I perhaps a bit disrespectfully called computer nerds, just got, geezers working on their machines. It turns them into geniuses like Plato and Descartes and Galileo and other, and philosophers, because it means that these computer nerds, as they're working out how computers work, they're penetrating the ultimate secrets, the kind of mysteries which philosophers have, over the centuries have struggled to understand. What is the nature of the mind? And it lifts them up. It sort of had to be true. And so what happened is, despite all the failures, all the complete disasters, nothing worked, of course, because it can't possibly work. I mean, just to say, to make it possible to talk to, missiles, the missiles would have to have a sense of humor. They'd have to have a sense of irony, a sarcasm. I mean, the whole of language is all about saying one thing and meaning another, not just pressing keys on a computer. Language is made out of kind of, metaphor, for example. And I would argue that there will never, ever be a computer equipped with a sense of humor, just for starters. But somehow it sort of had to be true. And so even when all the evidence failed, it turned into something rather like a religion. And in fact, in my book, I describe that. There is such a thing, there's a particular Western religion, and I call it scientism. The idea of science as this thing, this perfect thing, totally apolitical, just correct. Let's turn to the science. Let's, that. So Chomsky managed to embody that thing called science, which was scientism, at the heart of which was complete and utter nonsense.
And John Cox. John?
Hello.
Hello, John.
Hello. It seems to me that there are some ideas which are hardwired and are not derived from experience. For example, causality.
Yeah.
This is a classic one. You can have an event and there's another event, and the two events come together, but we have the idea that the one event causes the other event.
Yeah.
There's nothing there in the world that you can get hold of, which is causality, but it is an innate idea. Now, so Chomsky seems to me, to some extent, to have picked up this idea of innate logical concepts and run away with it.
Fine. If it stuck there, it would have been great. Yeah. Yes, John. I mean, clearly there are some, fear of snakes, fear of spiders, causality, all sorts of things are part of human nature, probably part of chimpanzee nature as well, of course. But carburetor and all these things, I mean, that's just complete nonsense. So, but I mean, I agree with what you've just said. There are some innate there. And of course, the American, they're mostly far-right people, the American far-right Evosite people, they highlighted precisely that point that you made, John, that some ideas are innate, to sort of extend it to things where, it was completely illegitimate to extrapolate.
Don't talk to Paul.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. Okay, sorry, I've got a screen here. Sorry, John. I should talk to this version of John over here. Oh, this one here. Yeah. Okay. Right.
Manchego and then...
Manchego. I'm going to talk to this Manchego here. I can see his name.
Manchego.
Go on, Manchego.
Speak loud so we hear it.
You haven't got your speaker on, Manchego.
Mute.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okie doke. Mark mentioned that or made the comment that the Apollo program was benign, as he said, but you still got to remember that the designer of the Saturn V rocket was Wernher von Braun, same guy who designed the V2.
Okay, Mark.
I have no argument about that, no.
Yeah.
Thanks for remembering that. Go, please. And repeat the question. Yeah.
So, to my understanding, at least from Hegel's theory of consciousness, he said that
Did you say Hegel?
Hegel.
Yeah.
For one to be able to say that I'm conscious and I think, there has to be someone else.
Yeah.
But from Chomsky's idea of how language came about. It was that somebody had that thing, that evolutionary thing that was a thing on his mind, and somehow then one person could think and then other people could. But has Chomsky ever replied to any theories?
Yes.
Can you repeat?
So, okay, the question is, well, it's a comment, which is that Hegel's idea about consciousness is that you can't be conscious of yourself except in the relationships to somebody else. You need an other to kind of indicate to you who you are. And there's modern versions of that. It's called social mirrors theory. And we have eyes which are good for looking into as well as looking out from. And it's quite true, I think, and undoubtedly true. The great, magnificent sociobiologist Sarah Hrdy's made this point very clearly, that collective childcare, allocare, children, meeting eyes with their carers and each other. You see, I look at your eyes, you're looking at mine, I see by looking into you, mind reading, I see an image of my thoughts, and that makes me aware of my thoughts for the first time. What Chomsky says is that dialectics is rubbish. And I've got various quotes from him. He just completely dismisses anything Hegelian, anything to do with self and other, all that. And of course, when you think about it, a computer doesn't need its reflection in another computer to know what it's going to be computing. So especially when you had these mainframe computers, which were just in a big room, it was just one individual, like, one machine doing stuff. And that was obviously going to be Chomsky's model. Whereas what we would need would be something more like a friend of mine, Luke Steele's, a robotics specialist who's worked out that in order to get anything like language up and running, you need computers that walk around the place, meet each other, recognize each other, say hello, and interact in order to learn things from each other and also learn who they are. So you need this self and other dialectic in order to acquire consciousness. Absolutely. I'm a great fan of Hegel. I think I was 17 or 18 when I read Hegel's Logic, the phenomenology of mind, and all those things. So I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Hegelian, and I'm glad you are keen on all that magnificent stuff. Did you want to say something? No. Sorry, Lawrence, yeah.
Yeah, no, because you're comparing him with Oppenheimer, and then Oppenheimer, I guess he did what he did because he wanted to be a scientist, and I guess he felt like one and one is two. But in Chomsky's case, it's very complex. It seems like he just believes in his own lies to be able to be a political activist on the other side of the coin. Was there any indications that he was aware that he was making it all up? I mean, is there any quotes of him that are so ambiguous that you think he must have been all along aware of his own lies? Because you're saying that he's basically a corrupt scientist. Ethically, it's wrong to just have taken this course.
I think Lawrence is saying that and Mark are being a bit too kind on Chomsky, that he must surely know that he was lying and about what he was up to with the military, and doesn't he recognize that? I think my answer, maybe Mark can chip in here, is that he kind of hides that for himself. I mean, he accused me of spinning a web of fabrication and deception. He's very hostile to my stuff, even though I try to make it absolutely clear how much I support his politics. Doesn't cut any ice with him at all. And he has said odd things, like there was no work conducted on campus at MIT, and then in the next moment he says the work was conducted 2 inches away from campus, like on the other side of a wall. But the point he's making, there was no military work was conducted at MIT, and then he says MIT was the main center of military research. So I think he has to conceal from himself some of those fictions, and it was, I don't know. What would you say?
Well, I think those who are interested should read what Noam himself says, which we published in this UCL book a few years ago about Chris's critique. He's extraordinarily rude. He describes your work as a web of deceit and misinformation.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Now, some might argue that the fact that he's so angry with us, or with Chris in particular, rather indicates we touched a soft spot.
Nerve.
So to me, that is enough. That is kind of an admission he knows something's going on. But one of the great tragedies of intelligence is that you can fool yourself just as much as you could fool anyone else. So the problem with the word corruption is I think we have a black and white approach. There are corrupt people and there are those non-corrupt people. Capitalism, I'm afraid, corrupts, or all class society corrupts everyone, because it's a fundamentally inhuman way of organizing society. You cannot be, so that doesn't excuse really bad behavior. But on the other hand, yeah, is in a very conflicted situation, and making him out to be a liar, a bad man, a bad person, or a saint, a genius who can never be criticized. That's just not the human condition, I don't think, anyway. He is conflicted. I think the psychoanalysts would have had a lot to say about it. Noam's always been very hostile to psychoanalysis, I think, if I recall, and I suspect I know why, but of course all psychoanalysts say the reason you don't agree with us is because you're not on your racist, so who knows? But I'm certainly not, if Chris is saying that Chomsky is a very bad man, I'm not with him at all, if that's what but clearly that's not what Chris is saying. Anyone who reads this book, you'll know that it's a lot of praise. And in fact, I think it's fair to say Chris is the only genuine defender of Chomsky, because anyone else who looks at all these contradictions will just throw their hands up and say he's a complete fraud. Unless you understand it at the level that Chris has explained, the only person in this book, then you can understand it. He's a human being, very bright, very humane human being who was in an almost impossible situation, and he handled it better than anyone else could.
And what we say in this Eon magazine article published in a week's time is that all of us, in a world where money talks, all of us have got to make a living. And, you know, so all of us in some way doing something, I don't know, even working for a bank, working for whatever it is, we're working for some corporation which is probably exploiting people in different parts of the world. And part of us rebels against it. And part of us thinks, yeah, but on the other hand, I've got to feed my kids. And we've all been there. One part of our mind sort of goes along with it, another part feels pretty uncomfortable. It's just that Noam was in an extreme version of that dilemma. For most of us, it's not that extreme, but all of us are familiar with the fact that we have to make compromises in this world, and some of them aren't all that nice, and we might feel a bit, I don't know, uncomfortable about some of the compromises all of us have made in life in order to keep body and soul together.
Can I just butt it? I mean, if you read what Noam did or didn't do during the student uprisings at MIT that we showed on the screen back in 1969, it's a bit disappointing. He kind of backed out of supporting the students as much as you would have expected him to under those circumstances. And I can see why some students, he admits it, really fell out with him. But he made up for it later. I mean, what can you say? I think when society really is changing, you probably don't need Chomskys or, so much anymore, because the people are changing their lives. In the meantime, to keep sane up to now, for my sake, and so I suppose I'm assuming everyone, you really have to read Chomsky to begin to make sense of this world. Then you can go beyond it, absolutely. But he was a vital part of our culture. Who will replace him? We'll find out.
Right, let's go with Anna first, and then Bernie. We want some women to talk.
So you've mentioned that, for instance, Chomsky was advocating for utilizing natural science as opposed to the social science when dealing with linguistics. So do you think partially it has to do something with subjectivity and false consciousness, for instance, with Marx would refer to? Because when child is being taught, for instance, inextricably, the child would be influenced by other humans and their ideas and notions. So do you think it has something to do with that as well?
Not quite how to repeat the question.
About natural science versus social science, and
the idea of false consciousness. I mean, yes. I mean, Noam Chomsky regarded all social science precisely as false consciousness. He said social science is pure reactionary ideology, and what we need is real science, politics-free science, proper science, which has to be natural science. And therefore he had to model language as something which was natural, and model the child as having language as something natural, nothing to do with engagement, nothing to do with learning, just it's natural for the child to have all these languages installed in its head. And of course, you can see where he was coming from. I mean, because in the United States, but in Western Europe in general, social science was mostly about managing people, how to get people to do this, that, and the other, how to control, which knobs to press, how to, you know. So social science is sort of managerial, because it's all about how to rule people. And you can see but of course you can also envisage, and I can, a kind of social anthropology, radical, revolutionary, you know, look at other ways of being human, which is social and not reactionary. But he had absolutely no interest in anything that I think is important about what it means to be human. And all the studies of hunter-gatherers, all the studies of other ways of living, he showed zero interest. And it was astonishingly, actually, when he did say a few things now and again, just showed astonishing levels of, I don't know, you can only say ignorance, actually. Absolutely astonishing. So for him, social science is rubbish, natural science is brilliant, therefore he had to stick to natural science, therefore language had to be nothing to do with anything social, including even communication. So language is not for communication. I mean, that really stunned his supporters when he came out really clearly. Even his rather unpleasant right-wing supporters like Steve Pinker said, come on, Noam, you can't say language isn't for communication. I mean, that's just going too far, but he stuck to it.
Bernie?
Oh.
Thank you. Both presentations were very insightful. I appreciate them. I did watch the Oppenheimer movie. And in the movie, Oppenheimer is asked if he's a communist, and he says something along the lines, I'm a communist like Picasso's a communist, meaning that he was in support of the Spanish refugees of the war. Yeah. And but Picasso died with a very wealthy man, right? Tens of millions of dollars. How good a communist was Picasso?
Well, that's a funny question. I mean, how good a communist is any communist? I'm a revolutionary communist. I'm proud of it.
You don't own a house. Not like Picasso.
But yes, I mean, and when I say that, I'm a revolutionary communist of the kind that we were when we became human. Hunter-gatherers are communists, and they have once-a-month revolutions. We won't go into all that. But how good a communist was Picasso? Oh, I don't know. I mean, you know, I would say anyone who described themselves as a communist in that period was sort of probably on the right side of things. But of course, Stalinism was a huge, huge betrayal, huge counter-revolutionary. Started was a deeply anti-communist force, of course, in the world. But we can go on about Trotskyism, communism, and all those things till the cows come home. But we're supposed to be doing anthropology here.
Questions in the room?
Yeah, so in your book, and I really enjoyed your book.
Oh, thank you. Makes it all worthwhile. Read it, everybody.
So you sort of place Chomsky in the context of revolution and, you know, his relationship to Roman Jakobson and perhaps also Levi-Strauss. So I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about, you know, how he fitted into all that.
Yeah, thank you.
How much he interacted with those people.
Yeah. Okay. The question is, in my book, I say lots of things which I didn't say just now, and among them are the way in which the Russian Revolution led to this brilliant idea that maybe we're on the brink of a world revolution, and if we have the world revolution, then at long last, consciousness can determine conditions. So, in other words, if we free ourselves from class society and oppression and war, and there's one world and we look after it, maybe we can consciously choose how to live. That was the idea, and one of the great figures of that process was a poet. I absolutely love this poet, Vladimir Khlebnikov, who had the idea of a kind of universal language, which would be a language of laughter and magic, and he felt that during the Russian Revolution, humanity was taken to its wings and speaking with its own voice for once, and within that came one of Khlebnikov's, Khlebnikov was his poet, Khlebnikov's admirers called Roman Jakobson, and Roman Jakobson emigrated to the United States and became the inspiration behind Claude Lévi-Strauss, the founder of structuralism, and also many of Chomsky's ideas. So what Jacobson did, he took Klebnikov's ideas about a kind of universal language of sounds, and Jacobson discovered that all the world's languages are made up of sort of digital switches, which is actually true, by the way. I mean, it's always a little bit controversial, but all the world's languages, if you're looking at their sounds, are on-off switches. Like, is voicing switched on or off? So, so you can switch off the voicing, switch off the voicing, the difference between bin and pin is just a switch. Switch off the voicing and it starts with the pin, switch on the voicing again, it starts with min. Close the lips, you've got m, open the lips, you've got and you have these articulators which are like switches which go off on, off on, off on, like digital switches. And Jacobson thought, this is very like, and this is before digital computers were invented. They had sort of mechanical computers like cash machines, sort of these little pedals and abacus things. But already before digital computers were invented, Jacobson was thinking that language was kind of digital because of these, what are called articulators, these switches in the mouth. And then Chomsky took that idea that the phonology of languages is digital to say the whole of language is kind of digital because the semantics is digital as well. And because the switches are part of our innate nature, we're all born with a tongue and a soft palate and teeth and lips. Maybe we're born with the meanings as well. And so, yes, in my book, I explain how what was actually a revolutionary idea coming from the Russian Revolution, as it crossed the Atlantic and we've got the Cold War and the American military took over, what was once a very revolutionary idea became the most conservative ideology ever, this horrible thing called the cognitive revolution, which turned upside down, I mean, common sense really, I would say, turned upside reason in the study of history, anthropology, language, and got rid of the body. Sorry, Camilla just reminded me, the critical thing is what we see with this cognitive revolution is the body disappears. So naturally, gender, sex disappears. But then everything disappears except this horrible concept of mind, mind over matter, which is, again, Chomsky managed to turn, which is, of course, a deeply patriarchal idea. All patriarchs, they always, whatever they're doing with their bodies, sometimes rather unpleasant things, their minds are up in heaven somewhere.
Tell us about Marvin Minsky and what he wants.
Okay, but very briefly, we saw Marvin Minsky meeting up with Jeffrey Epstein, which is very much the same theme I was mentioning with what some people do with their bodies. Marvin Minsky, he says the critical thing is we can now get rid of the whole idea of matter. You don't need materialism because matter doesn't exist. Humans are bundles of information, which he said is a brilliant idea because it means what you can do, you can beam yourself up, all the information out into the galaxies, and you never die, because all the information goes swirling around. Eternal sky gods is a very good way of putting it. Marvin Minsky seriously believed that we are made of information. There's obviously some truth in the sense that obviously genetics is information and all that stuff, but I mean, the idea was information is somehow immortal because it's free of the body. The body dies, the information lives on. Obviously, that's actually a sort of correct idea on the narrow level of genetics. When you die, if you've got babies or relatives, it's parts of your immortal information, your genetic structure lives on after you. But he does take that to weird extremes, and he's one of the people that came out of that very same revolution that Chomsky was involved in, financed by the U.S. military. And it's very similar to what's going on now with this guy Watermore about extraterrestrials, about communicating with this extraterrestrials. We are all information, and all these extraterrestrials communicating across the galaxies, they'll be all talking in English. Not what you and I mean by English, but what Chomsky means by universal grammar based on English.
I forget the name of it, but there's Chomsky's mates, Watermole and Roberts and others, they've set up some organization which I think is trying to get some funding to write some kind of code or language or messages to aliens using Chomskyan principles, because obviously everyone in the universe is communicating using universal grammar, so therefore that's what we should be doing. I don't know how far they've got with that, but they seem to be quite serious. Fortunately, I think Noam is just letting them get on with it. He's ticking the box, he's supporting it, but I don't think
I think Chomsky was quite pleased to find somebody in the military still believed in him.
Yeah.
And just, you know. So.
Have we got any more questions on Zoom, any more in the room? Otherwise, I'm going to have a rant.
Okay, Camilla's going to have a rant.
Not a rant.
Oh, right. Do you want?
Just, we can shut this down, but I want to segue for. Do I need that? No, I don't need that. Segue for next week. Just my little penance of thoughts on the Oppenheimer film, and thanks to Mark especially for kind of putting that context as the background of all of Chomsky's work. It really was a depiction of the most alienated patriarchy that you could possibly imagine. You could see the few women who were involved in it at all being kind of crushed and destroyed. There was actually one woman who snuck into the science somewhere along the line, but it was this mega destroyers of worlds and these incredible quantities of resources being built up into the military, whilst all the children were being pushed into the side and a nuisance and carried off crying, or just don't respond to the children when they cry. Chomsky's, not Chomsky's, Oppenheimer's super intelligent wife, I can't remember her name now, just dying and drinking herself practically until she kind of, and never mind his communist lover, but it was just that depiction was obviously very very real. And what we've heard about this making mind over matter, this principle is very much a patriarchal principle when it demotes and nullifies the contribution of body. And Chris has mentioned the work of people like Sarah Hrdy, that Chomsky can't take in anything about social relations, anything about intersubjectivity, anything about the ways that people talk to each other and look each other in the eye in his discussions of language. So for next week, we're going to be hearing completely the other side of the coin. I'm going to thank Mark and Chris as being a brilliant double act here tonight. Next week, we have another double act of Chris with Jerome Lewis. We're lucky that Jerome hasn't been able to go away to Madagascar. He should be here next week. And all the stuff that Chomsky does not talk about, all the hunter-gatherers, all the mothering, all the cooperative childcare, all the menstruation, all the laughter, all the messy, fluid stuff of real life. And we're going to be hearing When Eve Laughed, which is the talk about the book, which is almost the third book after this one. So I've always been blaming Chris. Why did you spend 20 years writing this book? You could write the book about language, the origins of language. So what's the right answer, not Chomsky's answer? So that's what's next week. So I hope people will be coming back for next week to hear something that, an answer which is probably much closer to the reality of what happened, certainly much closer than cosmic ray showers striking some Superman who suddenly was able to think for himself. Yeah. So anyway, thanks to Chris and Chris and Mark tonight, not Jerome, next week we do. So yeah, please say thank you to them and those wonderful slides and everything and the film. And I'm going to say goodbye to everybody on Zoom. Before saying goodbye, I'm not sure.
Can we just do the Aeon article on Chomsky that Chris has put together with a bit of help from me, is published on the December the 7th. December the 7th.
The two Chomskys in the Aeon magazine online. You'll find it, the Aeon Journal.
It's a good magazine.
We will put that link into Facebook and Twitter and anywhere on Radical Anthropology as soon as we have it. So yes.
I'm going for a brief drink.
Goodbye to everybody on Zoom. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll say goodbye to everyone in the loop. See you next week, I hope.
And anyone wants to join me for a drink, we're going to the